So for this class on Winchester Cathedral, I wanted to start off by saying people like to talk about thin places, so these places where we see God a little bit easier. So generally we see these as like Mount Zion in Scripture, or even places like the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem for our faith. So these places like Mount Zion are where a lot of people have had very intimate encounters with God, or in the case of the Holy Sepulchre, they're places that we're reminded of God's actions in our life, in the Holy Sepulchre, especially with the cross and the resurrection. So we talk about these general thin places, but we don't often talk about thin places in our own journeys, the places where God has spoken to us on a personal level and often just ourselves solely. So Winchester is one of those places for me. Originally I went to Winchester because of a pilgrimage. This is back in 2003. This is something the Diocese of Alabama put on for the youth of the diocese. And here in Winchester, we were specifically going to see the shrine of St. Swithin, who is one of the early bishops of the cathedral back in the 800s. And one of the chief miracles that St. Swithin performed was on this bridge. Now, this picture, just so y'all know, is the only picture in the presentation which is not mine. So I believe I got this off the Winchester Historical Society website, so this would be owned by them. But this is, according to legend, where St. Swithin performed the chief miracle he's known for. So on this bridge there was a woman crossing, and there was a bunch of people working on this bridge, and they decided to be really mean to her, and they pushed her, and she had a basket of eggs with her, so they push her, she falls, the eggs fall, and all break. Now, St. Swithin happens to be walking from the other side, meets her, helps her pick up the eggs, and when he picks them up, they're miraculously recovered. They're no longer broken, they're whole again. So the egg is seen as a symbol of St. Swithin. And my stole, as you can see, is a symbol of that journey. This is what I was given for my ordination. So you've got the bridge there, and then at the top there's the egg for St. Swithin. Then on the other side you'll see the Taizé cross that looks a little bit like a dove. And I'll be talking about some of that later. The second part of our pilgrimage was in Taizé, in the community there in France. So we did a pilgrimage 1 week in England and another week at the community in Taizé, France. This is all in 2003. But enough of that for now, because before I get into my own story, I want to talk a little bit more about the history of Winchester Cathedral. Because every time I've visited, and this is my third time to have visited now, I learned something more about the church and more about its history. And the more I learn, the more I feel connected with this church. So we'll start off looking at the very outside of the church. So Winchester Cathedral is a very old cathedral. It dates from 642 AD. And what you can see here, right outside the church in the yard here by the grass, are the remains of the original church that stood here, so that it would have been known as Old Minster. So when William the Conqueror came to England, Winchester was an important city in the realm, so he had a new church built here to show the importance, to show that he in fact had power over Winchester as much as he did over the area near Westminster where he was coronated. So this is one connection I feel with the church, because my ancestors on my mother's side would have come over with William the Conqueror. So one of the ways that we can see further the importance of this church and why William the Conqueror felt it was important to have this new church built on the spot is by who's buried here. That's how you see the importance. So right here, and this is in the choir stalls, the choir area, which we'll see more later, this is where one of the clergy, Bishop Henry Dubois, is buried, and there's many kings who've been buried here, but you also get clergy like Dubois here, and often clergy like him are directly related to kings. He was brother for the king at the time. Or on the other hand, we get bishops like Bishop Fox here, who wasn't related directly to the royalty, but he was the secretary and the keeper of the seal for the king. So oftentimes, this is such an important post that oftentimes bishops who were here would have higher offices in the kingdom. So again, important place, partly why William the Conqueror saw the importance of this place. One of the things that's just beautiful and that I love about Winchester Cathedral is that while it's a church that remembers the past, it's still functioning as a church as well. In fact, when we were there, every hour on the hour, they have prayers. Usually a layperson, in fact, will get up and say some quick prayers and then end with the Lord's Prayer. And we see this connection between continuing to remember the past while still functioning in the present as a church through the juxtaposition in this photograph. So here we have the very old baptismal font still in use, as we can tell, because there's the Paschal candle with a very modern candle holder for it. So that juxtaposition between remembering the past, but still being there worshiping in the present. And it's a great reminder, I think, to us too, particularly with the baptismal font, that we're baptized into the body of Christ, and that community stretches all the way in the past, all the way everywhere in the world in the present, and will continue to stretch on in the future. Now, the font itself dates back to our friend Bishop Dubois' time as bishop here. And you can't see it terribly well, but on the side here, the figures you see, these are depictions in the life and the acts of St. Nicholas, which is kind of cool. But now onwards to the church itself. So here you can see that the church is still in use and that it is currently undergoing renovation. In fact, this has been going on since 2014, which was 3 years ago, and was the last time I was here. And as we move closer, you can see a little bit better the altar frontal, which is a more modern altar frontal again, still in use. Still moving forward, oftentimes in the art that's depicted as well. And you can also see the rood screen. So that's this wooden screen, and that's to separate the nave from where the choir normally sits. And here we see the lectern that's just near the altar. And one of the things I particularly like about this and felt a connection with as I came here on this particular visit is the pelican. Now, in medieval times, the pelican was seen as a symbol of Christ because they believed at the time that the mothers would take part of their own bodies, their own feathers and blood, and use it to make nest for their young. So the connection with Christ giving his body for us and for our sins. The pelicans also happens to be the coat of arms of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, which is where I was attached when I was a seminarian spending a term at Westcott House in Cambridge. Here we see the pulpit. It's a style very similar to many pulpits you see in England. In fact, it looks very much like the pulpit I saw in Cambridge, where Thomas Cranmer preached a lot. And you might be able to see a little bit here. There's some etchings on the side, and you can see some more throughout the church of those etchings from different people throughout the years. Like many medieval churches, there's many side chapels, like the Epiphany Chapel here, or the Lady Chapel, which is given in honor to the Virgin Mary, which we'll talk a little bit more about this particular chapel later on. But now we're going to move to the choir seating behind the rood screen. And so this would be where the choir would normally sit. And we've got the main altar behind there. And zooming in on this, you can see once again there's renovation going on. And to give an even better sense of how long the renovation is going on, this is from Advent back in 2014. So same stuff still going on then. This is the pulpit in the choir side, which I think looks much more majestic than the other pulpit we saw. And then finally, this isn't a great picture of it, but this is the cathedra, which is the bishop's chair. And it's big and important, as you would expect in a big and important cathedral like Winchester. And of course, it's a huge sign right here that this is, in fact, the cathedral, the church that holds the bishop's chair. Now, Winchester also has a great history of learning, which you can see here with this side monument to Headmaster Wharton for the school connected with the cathedral. And here he is teaching the children about Aristotle and Homer, two of the folks that I learned about in my time at St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland. Also, one of the ministers for the church, Louth, his son actually discovered the idea of parallelism in Hebrew poetry. So that's where you get one description of something, and then the next line of the song is the same description but in different words. So next time we're at a service, listen for that, and you'll hear that parallelism in some of those verses. And even today, this history of learning continues. There's still students connected with the cathedral, including a recent graduate who happens to be the son of a friend of mine over in England. And this history of learning and all these people who've been there, this is another way in which I feel a great connection to this church. Continuing that sense of learning, we have a great author who actually is strongly connected with the church, Jane Austen. And she's actually the last person to be buried who is under one of these markers in the church. She's one of the last folks. When the later markers you see tend to be just memorials for people, but this is actually where she's buried. And getting a better view of that, you'll see here it's given in memory of Jane Austen. It talks about her father And it talks about the benevolence of her heart and just how her temperament, how people loved her. But the interesting bit is that it fails to talk about her accomplishments as a writer, which has since been rectified by a memorial plaque here, where the first thing you see is Jane Austen, known to many by her writing. Also, this is the 200th year anniversary of Jane Austen's death, and there's been a lot of ways the church has been commemorating that, including with this artwork you see right in front of you. Another really interesting thing about the church is that there's a little quirk with it. In the crypts, there's a flood line. So at various points in the year, it will flood. So here you see it just this past month in September with no water there. And then here, you'll see it back in 2014 in December, where there is very much a lot of water here. So, and there's a lot of commemorations, and the statue is one of them, of the many people who helped, and particularly one of the divers who went down under and ensured that the church was going to stay up and just flood and not eventually sink. And now this takes us back to where St. Swithin's shrine is in the back of the church. So this would be behind the choir area. So this was the area back in 2003 where our group made our pilgrimage. And right here you can see some of the icons amidst all the renovation that's going on. We'll get a little closer to those. And it was right in front of these icons that we did a reconciliation ceremony. Here's a further view. This is back in 2014 when they weren't doing renovation over here. So this is more or less what it would have looked like when I was there in 2003, minus the creche. This is in the Advent season. I was there during the summer. And so this actually would have been where you see the creche, where pilgrims would have come out and experienced the shrine of St. Swithin back in the day. When I went there, it was, again, with this group of youth from the diocese. In fact, one of my predecessors here at St. Paul's, Rob Morpeth, was with us. But we were being led by Bishop Andrus, who's now Bishop of California. Then he was Bishop Suffragan of Alabama. And so we were kneeling, sitting down at a prayer desk that, I don't know if it would have been the same ones that you see here, but it would have been ones that looked very much like it. And I remember going up, and Bishop Andrus said to me, "What's on your mind?" And before I could think about it, I replied, "Am I to be a priest?" And this was a big moment for me because I hadn't really realized that I'd been struggling with this question at this point. It wasn't really something that I was consciously thinking about. I'd had a few people in the past, and growing up, going to a church school, Advent Episcopal School in Birmingham, Alabama. You go to chapel every Wednesday. Church is a very, very big thing. I'd gotten the chaplain's award when we graduated, so I had had some people that suggest that maybe ministry was something that I should do, but I hadn't really felt a call towards that at this point. So I kind of didn't really think about it. I just sort of, it wasn't on my radar. And so this was a shock to me that this was on my mind at all, and that this was a question. So I was pretty shocked and confused at this point, and Bishop Andrus was kind and responded by saying, "Well, we'll pray for guidance then," and gave me a hug after that. So as I was confused and crying at this point, I went over to the Lady Chapel, which is right behind the shrine, again, in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so in there, there's these beautiful depictions. This is actually redone from the older uh, paintings that would have been here. So these would have been redone in the 1930s. These are depicting many of the miracles that Mary would have done. Here's the other side. And here's some of the stained glass there. Now keep in mind, in England, just as a side note, in England, if you see stained glass, it's probably pretty recent, because unfortunately back in the 1600s, you've got Oliver Cromwell and his cronies who went in and destroyed all these beautiful statues and all these beautiful stained glass windows throughout the country. Here's the front of the church, and unfortunately you can't see it well in this photograph, but this is actually in Winchester. They did something unique, and this is the only place I know of they've done something like this. They took all the broken pieces of glass, and they've kind of got a menagerie here of it, of just these random stained glass in place, which is kind of a beautiful idea, and again, sort of remembering the past, but also noting that we're moving on into the future. But back to the Lady Chapel, just to note too, another thing about it, and another connection I feel with it. You've got Joan of Arc right here. So back in the 20th century, there was a real need felt by the church to do something to commemorate her, to make reparations for the British role in her death. And near here, there's this sort of modern sculpture, and you can see the statue of Joan of Arc in the back. Here's a better view of it, of this mobile, and it reads, "I cannot speak well enough to be unintelligible." So this quote from Joan of Arc is just another connection point for me, since I was very young at the time I was here, and also sort of the sense of not speaking well enough, or even maybe not knowing well enough to be unintelligible. I kind of felt that same sort of confusion and just inability, not really knowing what's going on, because I was just really confused at this point. I didn't really know what had just happened in my life. And so this spot, and you can just see in the background, as you pan up, the statue of Joan of Arc here in the background. But this is about roughly the spot where I sat after this moment and cried for a bit, dried off my tears. And so this was the first spot where I stopped and really reflected on what had just happened. Because keep in mind, this was the fourth day on our journey, so we were not well into it. We were far enough into it that we knew everybody, but not well enough into it that we had chances for these sort of opportunities for God to work in our lives. And shortly after this, we would go on to the Taizé community in France, which is known for its contemplative prayer and also for its music. So this is particularly the contemplative atmosphere was really helpful for me to reflect on what happened. And as I did, I decided that I was really too young to be thinking about ministry right now. But somehow thinking that as I got home, it just made that sense that God was calling me to ministry grow stronger. And then in this same year, I would end up doing a brief internship for about a week following various folks around at my home church, the Cathedral Church of the Advent in Birmingham. And that was one way for me to kind of feel out what ministry was, maybe what ministry might look like to me. I got involved in Alpha and various other things. The sort of sense that God was calling me to something, I mean, it affected my choice to go to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, because I thought a well-rounded education would be good for ministry. Plus, I was interested in philosophy at that point. So really, this sparked the seed of what would slowly lead me to this point, my ordination into ordained ministry and my being here with y'all at St. Paul's. And again, you can see the stole here, sort of mapping that story, going from St. Swithin's Shrine to Taizé to really reflect on what was going on. So it's the start. It was the start of my journey, and then Taizé is kind of the end of the first chapter of that journey. So I'm still at this time moving forward in my own ministry, and I think it's helpful for all of us as we're moving forward in our own lives and in our own ministries to God, to reflect from time to time on our past, how we've gotten to where we are today. Every time I go to Winchester, I still get this feeling. There's still this presence. I mean, it is this thin place for me where God has acted in this really intense, deep, and meaningful way in my life. And I hope that each of you have places or moments in your lives where you feel God has spoken to you, perhaps in ways beyond your understanding. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening.